Mhm. Hello, I hope everybody had a good week and a weekend. I was really happy to see so many projects turned in. People are doing a really good job on them. And I noticed this morning that I completely spaced off opening up the next several modules. So I've opened up the rest of the class so you guys can all see what's coming up. And I wanted to go over a couple issues that I'm seeing with the projects and then dive into the material for this week. First off, the projects that I've seen have all been really, really good. People, I mean, and there's been a big range of different things from straight up research to projects where, like one person did cubism from, they read a substantial article about cubism and studied it for a while, and then they did a marker drawing of a still life. Excuse me, my nose wants to sneeze. They've done a marker drawing of a still life using the multiple perspective view of cubism that we've been learning about. Some of the issues that people have had are, most of them are really, really simple to fix. A couple people have done projects that did not fit in the scope of this class. Remember, you only get credit for the project if it fits within the scope of this class, which is 20th century art. So a project on ancient Egyptian art or Roman art or the Renaissance or 19th century work does not, it won't count. It won't have it do anything. Now, if you did want to do a project about Art Deco and look at how the Egyptian art influenced Art Deco, that'd be just fine. But you would need to do an introduction saying, I'm doing my report on Art Deco in the 20th century, and I wanted to examine Egyptian art as it influenced Art Deco. Then that would be just fine. We didn't really talk about Art Deco very much. Um, we mostly we mentioned it when we talked a little bit about Art Nouveau and a couple other things. But if that's something that's interesting to you, that would be just fine. But it has to tie in to 20th century art, and have you need to have an introduction where you make that clear as to what's going on. The people that have done that, and I pointed that out, they've turned around and tweaked their research projects and things like that, so it actually fit, and that's perfect. That will do it. Some of the really easy to fix issues that people been having is when they do an annotated bibliography, um, either doing things. The most common issue that people have had is doing things out of alphabetical order. Remember, it doesn't matter what order you want to present the information in. You need to present it in uh, the order so that each of the citations are alphabetically arranged, and then your annotations are associated with each of those citations. And a couple people have numbered their things, and then for whatever reason, the word program they were using did not maintain a consistent numbering, and I just asked them to clean that up a little bit. And some people have put accessed on date phrases in on a couple of their citations, but not all of them. And for full points, they need to be on all of them. So, and that's, so those are the most common issues, making sure that it relates directly to this course, 20th century art, making sure that your citations are in alphabetical order and correct MLA format, and that they all have the accessed on phrase at the end of them. A couple people have resubmitted their thing, and then they asked me, well, why hasn't it been regraded? And for whatever reason, Canvas did not show that they resubmitted anything different. And sometimes that Canvas, the resubmission will be the original file that was submitted, and I don't know why that happens. So if you don't see that I have regraded something, please email me and I'll double check it. A couple people have already done that, and it looks like the issue was just that Canvas didn't see their new submission. And for whatever reason, some of the, I don't know if it is um, what Canvas is doing to the files or what, but sometimes the MOV files are being flagged by my computer security program, and it won't allow or by Canvas, and it won't allow the file to be opened. If that's the case, please see what you can do about that. And if it remains an issue, the easiest thing to do is just to send me a link to your YouTube channel where you have the file on. And again, the PowerPoint presentations must all be done in video format, just like I say in the assignment outline for the different kinds of projects you can do. But all that being said, I'm really pleased with how people are doing their weekly reflections and everything else too. I think that stuff is looking really good. Today, what we're going to be talking about is, and I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. Today, what we're going to be talking about is foundational to the 20th century. We talked about Bauhaus last week and the influence of things like Russian constructivism as well as Bauhaus. And De Stijl is something that kind of spread the influence of the underpinnings of Bauhaus quite a bit all across Europe. And we still use this information today. The way it's laid out still influences architecture. It even influences how web design is done and modular furniture, like what you get at Walmart or, of course, IKEA. And it has its roots in people trying to find order in a very chaotic world. And it runs parallel in many parts, in many portions, to Russian futurism. Italian futurism. And I wanted to share this article with you from Wired magazine. This Wired article talks quite a bit about how it influences even web design today, the De Stijl. And De Stijl had its roots in quite a bit in, or had a lot of association with Bauhaus. And if you can't access this directly through Wired, let me know. If it is a problem, you shouldn't have to pay for a subscription on any of this stuff. And if it's a problem, let me know, and I will remove the link, because you shouldn't have to pay for anything like that. So when I originally accessed it, Wired was free. So if this is a problem for you, let me know, email me, and we'll get it taken care of. Now, this picture right here that I have is of the Paris Exposition. And this happened in 1900. And I don't know if you can tell, there's a lot of people, this almost looks like one of those impressionist type paintings because it is a hand-colored, hand-tinted photograph. But this is an elevated train, and the Paris Exposition of 1900 was absolutely astounding because all sorts of modern stuff was being shown to the public at large. Really, absolutely amazing stuff. First time people had seen it. And over the next 10, 15 years, people went from, you see right here, there's a horse drawing a trolley, to trolleys being run by electricity or steam engines, trains being used inside of cities for transportation of people in Chicago and New York, Paris and London. You have subways that are being done, and all sorts of wild stuff involving just travel. Then you also have communication technology that is going crazy. We see telephones starting to be introduced at this time, and a lot of wild stuff that people 15 years earlier had not even a dream that could ever be real. So it seemed like people were living in a science fiction world because stuff was so wild. And I think I mentioned last week that Pete Mondrian was one of these people who really felt that the world was running away. It was losing cohesion because of all the modernness. And the De Stijl, I want to watch this video. So this video, if YouTube does edit it out for us, please make sure that you watch this video. And this is in the second portion of this module. So we're going to go ahead and watch this video. It's only 2 minutes long, but I want you to kind of see how Stijl kind of impacts architecture as well. That was a really short video, but the thing that I hope you take away from it is one of the ways that people had to combat how rapidly the world was changing. One of the ways people decided to respond to that was during through the Stijl, or which means the style, where they simplified living and the things in the made environment as simply as possible. And we have these two manifestos, and I just want to remind you a little bit about this. Is the Italian Italian Futurism Manifesto, where Filippo Marinetti was talking about destroying the old, destroying history. We want to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and rashness. And the essential elements of our poetry will be courage, audacity, and revolt. If you read through this manifesto, it's all these points where it talks about celebrating violence against the old. And then we look at the Stijl. One of the first things I want you to see right here is the war is destroying the old world with its content. Individual predominance in every field. The new consciousness of the age is prepared to realize itself in everything, including external life. So instead of destroying, this is talking about realizing consciousness of people and recognizing the age people live in. It does say tradition, dogmas, and the predominance of the individual stand in the way of this realization. Therefore, the founders of the new culture call upon all who believe in reform of art and culture to destroy these obstacles to development, just as in the plastic arts. By doing away with natural form, they have eliminated that which stood in the way of pure artistic expression, the logical conclusion of every artistic concept. So they are talking about doing away with the old, but not by killing it, but by staying away or removing forms of expression that limit themselves to natural realism. And so, it's interesting to me where this talks about spirituality and consciousness and connecting with the new age by destroying the things that hold us back in the old age through exploring new avenues, not by killing. And I think that's a really fascinating difference where we can look at both the Italian Futurist Manifesto and the De Stijl, or the Stijl Manifesto. And what's fascinating to me is that it talks about the same kind of thing, moving into the new world, but in a very different way. I say here that the words that are used in the Stijl Manifesto imply and invite spirituality, sympathy, and unity, where people are drawn together by exploring the new art, not drawn together because they survived the destruction of the old. And I just think that that's really interesting. And here's another really good article by Artland about De Stijl. And you can see that this is one of Pete Mondrian's paintings, but you can really see how this thing kind of defines that whole idea of ultra simplicity, where he doesn't have any diagonal lines; they're all horizontal and vertical, and we're not talking about lots and lots and lots of shades of color. We're talking about essentially primary colors, and that's what it came to: primary and sometimes secondary colors. And this started in 1917, which is right about the time. This is the end of Italian Futurism, but this starts right around the time of Dada and Russian constructivism, as well as the Bauhaus. So this is another aspect dealing with a lot of the same issues. And notice that they were very parallel with the Bauhaus. Bauhaus ended in 1933 officially, and Pete Mondrian and De Stijl, that movement ended officially in 1931. So right as Nazis were getting into power. And this is a really good example of De Stijl style painting, where it's pure geometry. And in this case, we're not talking about only horizontal and vertical lines. We're also not talking about any color. I mean, there's essentially shades of white and black squares on their corners. And this is by Theo van Doesburg, who is another one of the De Stijl painters. Really some very interesting ideas. Now, neoplasticism, plasticism means changing, movement, being able to um, uh, morph something. And neoplasticism is returning to an ideal of malleability in thought, uh, where I think we can look at it as the Impressionists were trying to move away from realism so that people could see how they were seeing the world, and they were changing the forms that they saw in such a way that you could refer to that as plasticism. And the De Stijl saw themselves as, again, changing the world through what they saw, and they call this neoplasticism as a return to the same kind of idea. And that's not really a term that we're going to use. We're going to stick with De Stijl. Okay. And different artists argued about different things and agreed on different things. And both of these guys and all the artists were involved in De Stijl and reacting to De Stijl until their death. Sometimes, yeah, I think Mondrian lived until the 60s. And but the movement itself, as a cohesive group, they disbanded in 1931, and that's why we talk about that. And here's some of the iconic artworks of De Stijl. Recognize this, Pete Mondrian. We saw that in this dress designs, and I hope that you can get some sort of a sense of feeling with this. If you've ever been to IKEA, you'd see some of that same kind of sentimentality, not just sentimentality, but perspective, where you're using geometry not to be cold, but to create something that hopefully people can relax to. And you look at the designs of furniture. If you ever go to IKEA, a lot of those designs of furniture come directly from the Bauhaus and De Stijl, which is basically the Dutch version of Bauhaus, essentially. Now, this is Van Doesburg as well, and you can see the biggest difference between him and Mondrian is that he liked having his squares on the corner. He liked diagonals. And but you see that everything else is very similar. We have very simple use of color and very strong geometry shapes. And this is a beautiful example of a De Stijl style house. It is modular. And we talked a little bit about that week when we talked last week when we talked about Bauhaus. They have these things in the ceiling where they can take these partitions and move them around so that the homeowner can move the structure of the home if they want bigger rooms or smaller rooms, if they're having a party or they're having a lot of guests, they can change the house to fit their needs and their situation to help them to live their lives more comfortably and at more ease, which is very much according to the or connected to the manifesto that we saw a little bit, where it talks about uh, just expressing the consciousness of the individual who's living, as opposed to stressing violent destruction of the old. So I definitely recommend reading that article. And then this is a video, about 6-minute video, that talks about how the Dutch remember World War II. Well, one of the things that I like about this video, we're not going to watch this one, but this is Neil deGrasse Tyson. I love his voice, and I really enjoy how he is able to express his observations. Whether or not you agree with everything he says is immaterial. What is important is that he's really good at articulating how he views the world. Well, one of the things he talks about is that math and geometry seem to fall into place as universal languages. And this was, I like this because this is one of the underpinnings of the expression of the Stijl or the Stijl movement, where people use geometry to express or to provide a visual vocabulary to connect with human beings. Right? And I think what's interesting to me is that if you talk to anybody anywhere in the world, a vertical line is going to have more energy than a horizontal line. A horizontal line is almost always going to represent rest, and it does represent rest everywhere in the world. And you interject or you add diagonal lines, and that feels like more energy to everybody in the world. There are some things that are fundamental to everybody. Talk about some of the most comfortable shapes, and you're going to see the same shapes emerge um, over and over again when people talk about comfort level. What's really fascinating to me is when we watch, for example, uh, Chinese martial arts movies. And I'm saying this as an example because I really love them. And some of my favorite actors and choreographers are Danny Yuen and Jet Li. I think and Jackie Chan. I think they're absolutely amazing. And one of the things that's fascinating to me is that there are over 120 distinct martial arts styles in from India to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Bali, that whole area. And for Western audiences, we can tell what kind of person the character being portrayed is by their martial arts style. And the reason is, a big part is because of the movements of their bodies. And this relates directly to how geometry is expressed in dance. We know what the emotions are. We know if this person is a hero or a bad guy because of how they're moving. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. There was a study by Pew Charitable Trust about 25 years ago where they sent ethnographers and anthropologists to all sorts of cultures around the world, from super high-tech cultures like high-rise Tokyo, Japan, to people whose principal contact with the industrialized world was the fact that every once in a while they could come across the cotton T-shirt. And what was really interesting is they would show them a series of pictures for beautiful faces, beautiful bodies, faces that made you uncomfortable, bodies that weren't quite what you might expect, and different expressions of human form. And they would show them all these drawings. And what was interesting to them is they said that universally, regardless of the technology level and regardless of the contact human beings had with the rest of the world, universally, the things that people responded to is how close the human form approached the golden ratio proportions. I think that so it comes down to geometry, and I think that's absolutely astounding to me. So I want to watch. Let's see if we can. Let's see how long this one is. This is about 4 minutes long, and I really want to watch this one. I think that this will be a really good one too. This is about 4 minutes long as well. So I'm going to watch this one first, and then we'll watch this one. I think that this is a really good introduction to the de Stijl movement.
Der Stil, or the style, rises out of this idea of creating universality. It's based on the paintings and artistic ideas of Piet Mondrian, as well as the ideas of a Viennese professor by the name of Otto Wagner. And what we see is an abstract art movement marked by the use of rectangular forms and by an emphasis on primary colors or grays and blacks. In this case, you're looking at a painting by Mondrian, which should give you a strong idea of what we're going to see from Der Stil, which is Dutch for the style. Now, it grows out of Dutch neutrality in World War I. They found themselves rather isolated because they don't get involved in the war, either on the German or French side, and therefore are isolated by both sides, not just Germany.
What was really difficult is that the Dutch people, the Dutch environs, they really didn't have any way to defend themselves. And they didn't have an awful lot to offer by way of any potential conquering parties. And they saw what was happening around them. And they felt that during World War I, the best way for the survival of their identity was to stay out. So they tried very hard not to side with the Germans or with the people going against the Germans, with the British and France. And there's a lot of things that we can say about that for good or ill, but the reality is that their neutrality did allow them to maintain their cultural identity at a time when other communities may have been completely wiped out, and we're at the risk of being completely wiped out. So that's something to think about. Before we try to judge anybody, it's a really good idea to see if we can understand what they're thinking.
During the war, but arguably after the war. So they're going to develop their own artistic ideas. Architecturally, what we're going to see is this idea of artistic purity and geometric forms. Lines tend to be constrained to vertical and horizontal. We don't really see any curved lines. We don't tend to see any diagonals. In three-dimensional objects, including architecture, lines are placed in planes that do not intersect, making each element independent. And architecturally, the color is often limited to black, white, and gray, with the occasional spit of primary colors. So here we see, for example, this yellow upright, or the use of red here, and then on the horizontal member in front of the window. But you'll notice all of these planes.
One thing that you see as well is there's no diagonals. We have horizontals, we have verticals. This is a completely different structure back here that has nothing to do with this house. This was designed and built at a different time period. And I think that this is really interesting because, like I said, diagonals have a lot of energy, and the idea of de Stijl was to find rest and contentment as much as possible in the modern environment, a universality where everybody can feel potentially welcome.
Act independently, and a plane is simply a flat surface. So any flat surface is a plane, and they don't intersect. They don't really interact with one another in a more modern sense. In terms of furniture, they're going to be influential when we look at some of these later pieces, such as this Wassily chair. And here we see the use of color and line mimicking a lot of the ideas of the Stijl. They will also come up with the zigzag chair, which is typical of them. Here, the form is broken into a series of planes, and they've simplified the form. The idea behind the Stijl is
one thing that I think is really interesting to me is I can see a little bit of aspects of that Russian constructivism we saw last week. And one of our classmates is an expert in Russian constructivism. It's really interesting. She pointed out that it looks like people were doing the same kind of thing, but it was impacted or expressed by the culture that they were living in when they were trying to do it. And when we talk about geometric shapes and different forms not necessarily blending into each other, but being separate from each other, I see that in a lot of the Bauhaus stuff we looked at, as well as the Russian constructivist architecture that we saw. And I just think that that's really interesting. It seems to me that the common thread is trying to find this universality using geometry. And you get, yeah, these are interesting, they're engaging, they have bright colors, but they still feel very restful to me.
Is that by simplifying something to such a degree, what you're going to do is find the universal. You're going to find universal truths. It's all about trying to find these artistic laws that would create something beautiful to anyone in any culture, any society. Very tricky to do, and arguably Der Stijl doesn't quite hit the brief, but it doesn't mean that their experiments are worth any less. Now, when we move inside of that house that we just looked at, the Schroeder house, we get again that sense of Der Stijl. So again,
now what's interesting is that my wife and I just last weekend were at IKEA, and we saw this something very, very similar to this in several of the kitchen and bedroom sets that they had, where they showed the different furniture. I just think that that's really fascinating.
And planes of color. So we have the use of blacks, whites, grays, and then the occasional primary color, the bright yellow, bright red, bright blue. We see things very wide open, taking ideas from modernism, from Bauhaus. Again, that idea of bringing the outdoors indoors by having these massive windows and lots of light into the interior space. This is going to be really transformational in architecture, not just for Der Stijl, but of course for all of these movements, the idea of bringing the outdoors indoors. And it's interesting, it was Mrs. Schroeder who stipulated some of the design criteria, including direct exterior access from each room, a water supply for each room and in the bedroom, and at least two suitable positions for a bed. So the client who was looking for this wanted a great deal of flexibility, which may be part of the reason that we see a certain level of minimalism in this space.
Okay, I'm going to try to shrink that down, and we'll go to the next one, which is this one. This is also about 4 minutes long.
All right, so we're going to talk about De Stijl, also known as neoplasticism, literally means the style in Dutch. And it was an artistic movement that was centered in Holland that began in 1917 and lasted until roughly 1931. And as you'll be able to see from this video, it was both an architectural movement and an avant-garde visual art movement. And it was founded by a group of...
Now, this individual talks about it being avant-garde. Avant-garde is a phrase that you will hear, particularly from this time period. A lot of people use it to refer to Dada and different expressions of Dada, or things that don't quite make sense. Avant-garde is French for advanced guard. It's that the people that are trying to push the envelope, you know, the folks that are on the cutting edge of visual arts and architecture, for example. And for a while, that was the thing that was exciting, to be labeled as avant-garde. So that's what that's referring to. It's not necessarily a specific art movement as much as it is a description as where people are on the expectation continuum. Avant-garde means at the forefront, where you're pushing and you're probably going to embarrass yourself, but you're trying it anyway, kind of thing.
Of several artists and architects, but typically the most famous artist that we associate with de Stijl was Piet Mondrian and also Theo van Doesburg. These two artists really typified what these de Stijl paintings look like, and when we see them today, typically these works are by one of these two artists. And to be fair, I mentioned Doesburg because some of his paintings are in this video, but to be honest, really the only de Stijl artist that people have ever heard of, if they've heard of any at all, is Mondrian. So what was de Stijl all about? Well, roughly, it was a utopian perception of spiritual harmony. That was the way that Mondrian described it. It was an advocation of
I really like what this individual is saying, that it's an expression of a hope for utopia. And I think that that may be why it does feel like it shares so much with Bauhaus and Russian constructivism, because both of those movements as well were reaching towards some sort of utopia. And I think that that's really beautiful. It's very hopeful, I think, regardless of whether or not you agree wholeheartedly with every element of the philosophy behind these movements. The fact that the people contributing to them were trying very hard to make an ideal world, I think says an awful lot about where their hearts were.
pure abstraction. These paintings are purely abstract. But the big point of emphasis that separated this from other abstract movements like Cubism or abstract expressionism is that there is this kind of universalized reduction to just the essentials of form and color. So these paintings are very simple. They are simple visual compositions consisting primarily of just vertical and horizontal lines, basic shapes like squares or rectangles, and primary colors in addition to black and white. So these de Stijl artists were a lot more concerned with the nature of form and color themselves than they were with the appearance of the world around them. In fact, Mondrian himself believed that the three-dimensional world was deceptive in a way, and that de Stijl aimed at getting down to the essence of meaning within the world.
I think that that is really an interesting perspective as well. Do you remember a little bit when we talked about phenomenology in relationship to Cubism? I think that that opens, that description of de Stijl, where Mondrian was thinking that the world that we see every day is kind of deceptive. I really like that because that ties in with like contemporary ideas of physics, as well as I think there's a connection there to Husserl and Heidegger when they talked about phenomenology that we were looking at a while ago. I just think it's really interesting. These guys were thinkers. This is not something that they did to shock anybody or to attract a new audience or to make people believe that they were too stupid to understand what was going on. They were doing these things on purpose to help us, or to help us think that maybe it's worth thinking about. And I think that's really fascinating.
The world on its most simplest basic levels. That's why there's such an emphasis here on just the primary colors, black, white, simple shapes. A lot of people look at these paintings and, it's kind of the stereotype, oh, well, I could do that, that's not art. And, well, you're probably right. You probably could do this. But the point is that that's the whole purpose of the painting, is to make it as simple as possible so that the artist is capable of expressing just those basic attributes of the world, which the de Stijl.
And do you remember our conversation about the people who say, oh, yes, I can do that? All of us at some point have seen something and say, oh, yeah, it looks like a cat threw up on the screen or something like that. The reality is, yes, almost anybody can do it. But it takes one person to be first. And I think, and being able to not just be first, but be able to write a manifesto describing why you're doing it first, I think is pretty impressive.
Artists believed most accurately represented the true nature of reality itself, as opposed to what our eyes told us was the nature of reality. So they painted these asymmetrical paintings where there was a lot of opposition, they would call positive and negative, emphasis on different colors and lines and shapes. And this fascination with shapes was something that was borrowed from Cubism. And like I said, de Stael was an abstract movement of art. It had a lot in common with other kind of sub-movements of abstract art, except de Stael was by far the most reductionist of the abstract movements. One interesting thing is that the artists did not frame their paintings. The Stahl paintings are never framed because there was this belief that these paintings were supposed to be continuous extensions of the world. They weren't supposed to be, sequestered from their atmosphere. They were supposed to be an intimate part of that. After all, these artists believed that this is what the true nature of reality.
When you can kind of see that right there here, these paintings are on boards. They don't have that kind of museum quality frame around them. And that's what this author is pointing out, with the implication being that this is just a section of a larger design, that it's not framed because somehow this can continue on all sides. So it's something to think about.
Was that we needed to put more emphasis on what red means, what a straight line means, what a square means. So yeah, I mean, it seems kind of weird to us, but it's an avant-garde art movement. It's bound to be a little bit weird. And as always, if you like art as much as I do, please don't.
So I thought that was nicely done. A very good, concise. Both of those are really good and concise. Now this one, I want to share a little bit about this with the architect. We're not going to listen to the whole thing. We're just going to look at it, look at some of these images. And this is really kind of fascinating to me, where we have different expressions. You can see where that de Stijl simplified shapes and stuff is coming into play. But if you look at this, it's pretty obvious that this is a little bit more than that hyper-reductionist perspective, where we can kind of see here's the nose and here's out of focus eyes. You can see that this is a portrait of somebody. And I think that's really fascinating. And this is, I think, a really interesting perspective as well, to remind us that de Stijl was intended to move away from the confines that people have in expecting realism and demanding realism. Because one of the assumptions is in de Stijl is that perhaps what we assume is real is deceptive. I don't know if you're familiar with optical illusions, where you can look at something that from one perspective you think it might be a rabbit, but from the other perspective it's somebody wearing a necklace who's facing away from you, or different things like that. There's lots of different kinds of optical illusions, but that was used by these artists to demonstrate that the world that we see every day doesn't represent reality. Reality is something a lot deeper, more profound. And by going to the most minimal of colors and the most minimal of expression, the invitation is there to help us to try and engage with what the thing that is more real than the reality that we see. And actually, let's just go ahead and watch this. It's only 2 minutes long, and I think it will actually be really worthwhile. Let's see. Oh, I hope so. I can't remember the narrator's voice.
De Stijl, or neoplasticism, is an artistic movement founded in 1927 by a Dutch painter called Theo van Doesburg. It influenced painters, artists, furniture designers, and architects such as Piet Mondrian and Jacobs Oud. Theoretically, de Stijl called for a balance between the individual and the universal, and for the liberation of art from the constraints of tradition. The movement's essential elements are abstraction, simplified rectangular.
Again, I want to point out that the difference in manifesto between de Stijl and Italian Futurism, they talked about the liberation of art from the bindings of tradition. They are not trying to kill anybody. They're not trying to destroy history. What they're trying to do is create a new world by giving people permission to do what they feel driven to do in art, to try not to be bound by the limits of having to express something that everybody else can immediately recognize and understand. Which I think is, in the long run, so much less expensive than if you want to change the world by just starting wars with everybody.
Geometry and primary colors. The artists and architects that adopted this movement used yellow, blue, and red as the main colors of their artwork and considered them as the only existing colors. Yellow represented the ray or the vertical movement. Blue is the color contrasting yellow, and it is the horizontal firmament. And red is the meeting of point between yellow and blue. The movement also limited its expression to rectangular geometry shapes and justified it by referencing two contrasting powers: the horizontal line that draws the course of the Earth around the Sun, and the vertical line for the movement of the sun rays emitting from its center. One of the most famous Stijl architectural works is Schroeder House design by a Dutch architect called Gerrit Rietveld. The house was built with respect to essential points of plastic architecture defined by the movement. Its shapes are elementary, economic, and functional. It is also unmonumental and dynamic, anti-cubic in its form, and anti-decorative in its color. The house has a dynamic, changeable, open planning concept. It contains a traditional ground floor where the sliding and revolving panels provide flexibility to the upper floor. It is a good example of the anti-cubic architecture that does not try to freeze the different functional space cells in one closed cube. The facades are a collage of planes and lines whose components are purely detached from each other's and has its own form, position, and color. And finally, the colors were chosen to strengthen the plasticity of the facades. The Schroeder House and many other examples from the Stijl movement are a living proof that simplicity and the elementary approach to design can create bold, daring, and interesting art pieces. We are publishing educational videos on architecture on a regular. Stijl, or neoplasticism.
We don't need to watch the rest of that because the rest of it is an ad. I definitely look up these articles, and I think that these are really worthwhile to look at. This talks about the movement, artists, and famous works. I think this is a really worthwhile article. And again, de Stijl is Dutch for the style. And the style is specifically trying artists developing a non-traditional way of expressing universal forms or connections. And the way that they would do that is by refining things or simplifying things down to horizontal and vertical lines, geometric shapes, usually squares and rectangles, trying to stay away from more complicated lines like diagonals, and then doing everything possible to stay as close as possible to simplified colors. So black, white, gray, and then red, yellow, and blue. I think that's really interesting. And these are many of the main players. There were about 30 different artists that did this, but these are the main ones. Van Doesburg and Mondrian were the two people that are credited most often with being the founders of the movement. And I believe it was Doesburg who wrote the manifesto we were looking at. There were also, what's really fascinating to me is that there were also glassblowers that were doing this too. And I don't know if I found any of the glassblow art that I don't know if I'm sorry, I don't know if I put any of that in, but it really fascinating, interesting. And a couple of these artists, instead of just limiting themselves to horizontal and vertical lines, also played with very simple arcs where it's just a very shallow curve. And they would put that in as well. And you can see some of this in, or the influence of this still today. If any of you have any of the Windows type programs, the very logo for Windows is based on this. The logo for Chrome is based on this, on de Stijl. The way your computer screen and most websites are done today is based on Bauhaus and de Stijl. Visual architecture. Visual architecture is the way people would put visual imagery together. It's not just creating buildings. But definitely read through this article. It's really excellent. This talks about the history of the movement. This is Theo van Doesburg himself. And then Piet Mondrian. It's really fascinating seeing him grow into de Stijl because he was a contemporary of Vincent van Gogh. And so a lot of his earlier paintings look very much like the earlier paintings of Vincent van Gogh. So we see Impressionism, we see Fauvism, and we see expressionism, like what it's just the same kind of arc that Vincent van Gogh did. And sadly, Van Gogh passed away before going going doing a lot more with his expressionism. But Pete Mondrian kept going, and he, I think, being concerned about how runaway, rapid, and just uncontrollable it seemed like the modern world was. I think that that really influenced him, turning his art into and directing himself into the energies of building a utopia through simplified form and geometry. I think it's just really, really amazing. And so here we see some famous works. And here you can see this very much. What is really interesting to me is, believe it or not, a lot of Pete Mondrian's paintings like this are actually based on landscapes. They're not just extrapolated geometric constructions. They are simplifications of what anybody could see. Again, he was saying, well, let's get behind reality and see what reality might actually be. And you notice that in like this one does have a frame around it. We talked about how that was not how it was intentionally done, originally done. You'll see in a lot of Pete Mondrian's paintings, these black lines don't go all the way to the edge. And that kind of implies that there shouldn't really be an edge to this, that the design is designed specifically to continue on past the confines of the paintings. And it's interesting to me that Van Doesburg and Pete Mondrian, yeah, they look really similar. But some of the differences is Pete Mondrian really, he was a sketcher, he was a draftsman, and he loved drawing. And I think that that's one of the reasons why he put so much emphasis on these lines. And Van Doesburg loved building. And I wonder if that's why he has so much emphasis on these shapes. And you'll see also, he'll do large paintings very similar to this too, but Van Doesburg's will have the squares at an angle, which is really fascinating. And Gerrit Rietveld, he was a builder. He's the guy who designed the Schroeder house that we saw, and he designed this chair. And you can see this chair really belongs in that house. You see the black lines, horizontal and vertical. There is a little bit of angle here, and I think that this is specifically in response to how the human body is, what the human body needs. And when Rietveld built anything, he built it for the comfort of the people living in it, for the flexibility of the lifestyle of the people that were going to be living in there. And I think that that's absolutely incredible. And you can really see that in the way he built this. Remember, in all this, all the walls are movable. So that, and every room has access to water. Every room has access to an entry or an exit. So it's designed to be incredibly flexible to meet the demands of the life of whoever is living in it. And then I think it's kind of funny too that there's a lot of contemporary designers that will riff on these concepts as well. Some very interesting stuff. Now, and there's some really fascinating quotes that talk about, and Neil, I'm going to say plasticism or plasticity has to do with change and malleability. And it is a very confusing term, and that's why we're going to stay with de Stijl instead of neoplasticism. Because I talking about the style makes a lot more sense to me, because when you look at the artwork itself, it feels very static in some situations. There's an energy there, but it's designed to feel calming and stationary. And that, in my mind, doesn't lend itself to the word plasticity. So I prefer to think of this as de Stijl. And that's the, and there were several names for it, but that's the one name that we're sticking with. So definitely read through this article as well. And this shows some of the different artists, what they were doing. Now, Vilmos Hujar, what is so interesting to me about his work is you look at this, you have a lot of that same kind of geometry, but you are seeing as well some of like cubes on on seeing the corner of a cube, and this person incorporated a lot more diagonals into it. And I love this when it talks about influence of Dada and Italian futurism. I think you can kind of feel that in there. This person is using a circle, but we don't see that in Van Doesburg's or Mondrian's work very much at all. And it's interesting to me that this kind of shape, the cube on the corner, is a very symbolic thing as well. Yes, there are diagonals, and it still is fundamentally a stationary shape. And I think that that's really fascinating. And then the circle, I wonder if that's in there just to kind of break up everybody's expectations. But this individual is still, there's like 3 shades of gray, and it's very simplified forms. And then this is Garrett Ratefield. This is the chair and the house that we looked at. I think it's absolutely amazing how, and this chair is actually, styles of chair like this are actually very comfortable to sit in too, compared to what you would expect, which I think is really fascinating. This is where Van Doesburg, you can see that he's doing the same thing that Mondrian did, but he's putting everything on diagonals, which is really interesting. Here's Mondrian, and here's Van Doesburg painting. I think that that's really fascinating. Here's that house that we keep seeing. Very interesting. And I don't know, I just think it's really interesting that these folks were trying so hard to create a utopia by destroying the old, not by destroying it violently, but by trying to incorporate it into a new vision of a world where things like geometry and math are viewed as universal visual languages. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And you can see the influence of architecture with the American Prairie style. You know, we talked about how connected that is to De Stijl and, I'm sorry, the Bauhaus and things like that. What's really fascinating is you get Frank Lloyd Wright, who defined American Prairie style. It looks very much like these early houses that were heavily drawn from and were done by people that founded the Bauhaus and De Stijl. I mean, this looks like almost like Frank Lloyd Wright Prairie style home. And it's built on the same kind of simple application of fundamental geometry, and I think that that is just amazing. There's another drawing for a chair. I don't know how this would be comfortable. I have sat in this one, and it is a lot more comfortable than you'd expect. This one, I can't see how comfortable that is. It seems to me that sometimes furniture was designed specifically so that people could buy it, put it in their home, and impress their friends. That's what I see. But these chairs, you still get these chairs at Walmart and IKEA. Also, it is the quintessential functional modular chair, and that is very much a De Stijl / Bauhaus design. These are really interesting. You can see this if you have children or friends that take their kids to daycare centers. There are several daycare centers that will use this. And what's interesting about this kind of design sensibility, what's interesting about that is that young minds, as they're developing, seem to respond really well to these kind of fundamental shapes and fundamental colors. And that helps the young people gain a foothold on their understanding of the universe to the point where they can open up to much more complicated concepts and making that an easier transition. I just think that that's really fascinating. And then this, I think it's really cool to see the Russian constructivism right next to the De Stijl. And you can really see that these guys are sharing an awful lot of visual vocabulary. I feel that's just absolutely amazing. So we looked at Pete Mondrian. I call him the poster child of De Stijl. And it's interesting, here's one of paintings inspired by him. Here's a dress that he designed. No, this isn't a dress he designed. This is a dress designed by Yves Saint Laurent, but it was inspired by Mondrian painting. And it's really fascinating to me you can see the direct connection between this and the paintings. And this talks about his art style quite a bit. Let's see, this is yeah, I don't think we need to watch that one. But what I do want to do is, this is really fascinating to me, this right here. After World War II, Pete Mondrian moved to the United States about that time. And he lived in the US, and he ended up visiting and living in New York for a while. And if he was creating this artwork to try to overlay some sort of simplicity onto the just astounding complexity of the modern world, it's interesting to me that he would choose to enjoy his time in New York. When he first encountered New York, he despised it. He thought it was way too busy, too many people living in too confined of a space. But after he lived there for a while, he started enjoying how all these different people living together with energy and relative harmony. And this is called Broadway Boogie, this painting. And it really is an expression of his perspective on living in New York. And you can see that simple geometry. But then what's fun about this is Jason Moran is a piano player, and he composed some jazz piece to play while you're looking at the painting. And I think that is really fun. So definitely watch this video. And it's just an absolutely interesting story. But this is one of the last paintings that Pete Mondrian did. And you can see that it does combine some of that energy of the modern world with that simplification and or that unifying simplicity that he sought in his paintings. And I think that's really very, very cool. I'm just checking to see how long this is. Talks about a deconstruction of a painting, and that might be worthwhile. This is only about 2.5 minutes long. And like I said, there's a couple dozen de Stijl artists. Pete Mondrian was just the most prolific painter. That's why we're looking at him. And but there, and in just a minute, we'll look at a few more of the artists that you can examine as well. So let's go ahead and watch this.
These bold colors and grids are the hallmark of artist Piet Mondrian. But the same artist, still known today for his instantly recognizable patterns, started out painting these. This summer, an exhibit at the Gemeente Museum in The Hague traces Mondrian's path from that to this. Benno Temple, the museum's director, explains.
So in the Netherlands there has always been a very strong tradition in landscape painting, dating back from the 17th century. And it was almost a golden rule. The horizon was low, so you had 1/3 of the painting being a landscape and 2/3 of the painting being sky with the famous Dutch clouds.
But even in his early career, Mondrian is ready to break the rules.
He has his early painting around 1900, a ditch by a farm. A landscape with the horizon very high, so there's almost no sky. And there is a tree standing in the foreground of the painting, dividing the painting into, you could almost say, squares and lines.
In 1911, Mondrian moves to Paris, where the Cubist painters Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso influenced Mondrian to experiment with increasingly abstract styles. In 1915, Mondrian returns to the Netherlands and joins the Laren artist colony, where he befriends two artists who push him even further toward abstraction. Together, these three participate in the founding of the de Stijl movement. Like many artistic movements at the time, this group tried to make a definite break from the past. No more Dutch clouds and windmills for these guys.
I want to show you something really quick. This is called the skaters. Keeping in mind, they are trying very hard to simplify forms to geometry as much as possible. Now, can you see the humans in this? Here is the torso. Here are the hands behind the person's back. This is one leg. This is another leg with there's skates right there and the head leaning forward. Another person. Here's another person. Here's another person. Here's another person. Can you see those? This person, this individual this is one of Hussar's paintings, but you can see there are these people in there. And I think that that's really fascinating.
or Dutch clouds and windmills for these guys. Mondrian calls his style at this time neoplasticism. Mondrian writes,
This new plastic idea will ignore the particulars of appearance. On the contrary, it should find its expression in the abstraction of form and color, that is to say, in the straight line and the clearly defined primary color.
it all boils down to straight lines and primary colors, the signature Mondrian look you see in stores and on runways today. But despite how far Mondrian's style evolved from Dutch landscapes, it's still possible to see a connection to his early works.
Although they're completely different, one is figurative, the other is abstract. You see that it's almost the same division of picture planes. And that's not done on purpose, it's done by intuition.
I think that's really fascinating to me, looking at that. Now, here I have a selection of different artists. We've already looked at Theo van Doesburg. We've looked at Gerrit Rietveld, his architecture. Here is this is Hajar. We already saw some of his paintings, and I want to look at some more of his work. This is some of the early stuff he did for advertising, but you can kind of see, like Van Doesburg, he likes those diagonals, but he's still using the very strong rectangular shapes, black and gray and white, and he's also using the primary colors. And this one, you can see he was one of the people that really loved applying circles as well. And the circle will fit into de Stijl. It's just not used very often. But again, the person is using as simplified geometric shapes as possible. And I think that's really very interesting. And this is Bart Vanderlyck. The stuff that he did is a little bit more fluid compared to those rules that we saw that Piet Mondrian and Van Doesburg did. And what's interesting to me is that you can see this is right before de Stijl picked up. So right before, you can already see him moving away from the idea of the different conflicting planes like in Cubism to simplifying colors a lot. And here he is using diagonals, but he's still using primary colors. And he was probably the most figurative out of a lot of these painters that we've looked at, where you can almost see human forms and recognizable shapes in these paintings. Like this looks like a building with people in front of it, or it can, if you in the right set of mind. But it's interesting to me that it seems like Bart Vanderlyck is really exploring the fundamentals of visual balance and visual expectation. He's well, I'm not going to say without trying as hard as he can not to do the expected, what you would expect realism to provide visually. And I think that's really fascinating. And this seems to be moving far away from what we've seen in the other de Stijl stuff. And this is very much fitting with it. Even though these shapes are not those typical circles, squares, and rectangles, they are all very fundamentally based on those same kind of shapes. And I think that's really interesting. He also played around with ideas like this is a mosaic that he did, and he would do enameled things, enameled painting and stuff like that. And I think just really interesting things. And I wonder if you can see animal forms. Like in this, here's a person riding on the horse. Can you see that? Here's a head, shoulders, arm holding reins, and this is the left leg. Here we have a horse that's both hind feet are planted and one forefoot is raised, and here's the horse's head. Can you see that? And that's really interesting. And here, of course, is a whale or a fish. Now, this guy I like, George Bentangolu, did some really interesting things that dealt with forms that other de Stijl artists were not really comfortable playing with. He used curves. And some of his stuff, even though he identified as a neoplasticist or de Stijl, some of his stuff, it seems to me like it pushes a ways away from what other people are doing. So this is right at the beginning of the movement, and you can really see those fundamentally simple geometric forms. And this is a person sitting in a chair or on a throne. And it's interesting to me that he was trying so hard, as with the other de Stijl artists, trying very hard to simplify things down to horizontal and vertical planes or shapes or lines, with very simplified geometric shapes. And this is how a lot of his sculptures are, basically blocks of stone or brick or wood in this case. And some of these things I think are really beautiful. They're not designed to necessarily challenge you energetically. They are designed to get you to think about how geometry can fit together. There aren't a lot of diagonals, but what is interesting is that he did start using curves, and you can see that in some of the drawings and paintings that he did, where he has a very simplified lines of just like the other de Stijl people. This is after the end of the official de Stijl movement, but this is a swan. But it's interesting to me because you can still feel, I think, some of that same simplified energy, even though he's moving away from the standard expression of simplified forms. He is still trying to create some sort of universal language that it avoids or tries to stay away from expectations of things that you normally see in art. And this is some of his glass work, where you can see these very shallow curves, rings. Here's another shallow curve. So doing a lot with very slight and subtle curves. Sometimes they're a little bit more engaged, but I think it's really interesting, still staying in that same kind of simple, relatively simple geometry, as well as trying hovering around um, the primary colors. And this is one of the more beautiful glass designs, I think. It's an endless, it's an endless rod. You can't see the end of it. It goes around and around and around forever, kind of like a Mobius strip. And to me, this feels like, yes, it's 1950. It's after the end of the official de Stijl movement. But I feel that this is still, he's trying very hard to stay away from expectations of realistic form, but he's trying to express something that hopefully anybody can find commonality with. It's a beautiful flooring curved shape that goes in on itself, that starts and ends throughout. There isn't a beginning, there isn't an end. And I think that this kind of thing is just, it's really beautiful. If you have OCD, it's kind of frustrating because there isn't an end and there isn't a start. But I love this because I think it does speak, even though it breaks a lot of those expectations we have with de Stijl, it still kind of feels to me like it's talking on that level where it's addressing simple universal forms and geometries. And I love this. This reminds me an awful lot of Broadway Boogie. And it was done within 9 years, I believe, of Broadway Boogie. And that is just really fascinating. I love this glasswork because this really feels to me like it is very much de Stijl. And then he also did these kinds of things with, this is layered glass fused together with colors inside. And I think that's really very interesting. And then of course, this is one of his paintings, very early painting when de Stijl was first started. And you can really see that this guy fits in the same club as Piet Mondrian, Theo van Doesburg, and those guys. Very, very similar. The only thing missing is he doesn't have the black horizontal and vertical lines. But this also feels very much like that. And you can see from the time period, 1918. And this is very much Piet Mondrian inspired. You know, he's really connected to that kind of universal geometry. And here he's a little bit crazy, as you see orange and green and purple, but still it feels like it's very much that same kind of visual vocabulary. And I love the fact that Van Tongerloo loved experimenting with more than just the colors everybody else was expecting. I think that's very cool to see. And here's Van 't Hoff is an architect who, this guy started a little bit before the Stijl in his thing, but you can really see a lot of that aspect of what in the US it was Prairie style of Frank Lloyd Wright, but I think you can also see a lot of that stuff that we saw with the Bauhaus and Russian constructivism, as well as the Stijl. Very simplified planes. This doesn't seem to have the same kind of flexibility as that the Schroeder house, but there's a lot of wide open space inside, and it is designed for people to enjoy living in it. And I think that's really fantastic. So this whole thing is actually animation of putting the house together, showing it with its geometry and stuff. And I think you can see a lot of that fundamental De Stijl square and rectangle geometry. And I think it just, you have a roof that is not the expected roof that we normally have, but it does feel very much like what was being done in the US by the Prairie style artists. And then Oud is another architect, same kind of thing, who very much De Stijl. And for my mind, this is a lot more like, I think it was Van der Beugel that we saw, the guy that does the curves. But it's just really interesting to me that this artist, this architect, the architecture looks very much like what you might expect if Piet Mondrian built houses. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, look at this. I mean, that looks like a Piet Mondrian painting almost, doesn't it? I think that's really interesting. Oud really enjoyed working with the style quite a bit. And it's very much an expression of fundamental universal geometries. And I think that's really fascinating. And then here's a designer. Piet Zwart is the last person to look at. And this person is one of the few that really worked with typesetting in his design. And I think that this is really fascinating because he's aware of how letters are formed, and he's trying to express the letters in their form in the same kind of way that Piet Mondrian did with his painting and Van Doesburg did with his architecture. I think it's really intriguing, being very aware of fundamental geometry, simplified shapes, dynamic energies, as opposed to making things that were excessively realistic. And this kind of thing reminds me very much of the Russian constructivism that we looked at. One class member, one of our classmates, did something where they remade a Russian constructivist propaganda poster with visual elements from today. That was absolutely fascinating. And they showed a lot of these kinds of elements they were paying attention to. And it's just interesting to see that this very much looks like an IKEA kitchen. This Piet Zwart's design reminds me very much of IKEA, and it reminds me a lot of the Russian constructivism, but you can really see these strong shapes that were so indicative of De Stijl. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Primary colors. And this person did magazine posters, advertising, layouts for magazines, all these kinds of things. very interesting stuff, but with using those kinds of elements of the Stijl visual vocabulary. I think it's absolutely astounding. And I wanted you guys to see how sometimes we get in our heads that a specific style will only ever look a specific way. And sometimes artists step away from our expectations quite a bit. Sometimes we can see exactly where they're going. Sometimes it's a little bit harder. But I want you to apply those rules, those tools of artistic critique to all this stuff that I'm showing you, so you can try to generate some sort of a context for yourself, uh, so that you can really begin to understand how the Stijl was articulated visually. The unifying factor is not everything looks like a Piet Mondrian painting. The unifying factor is simplifying forms to fundamental geometries. Trying to, the motivation of the artist is to try to develop visual language that's universal, that's not specific to any one culture, but it's something that everybody can find a relation to, and which is really hard. Colors are going to mean different things in different cultures. Shapes are going to mean different things in different cultures. Physical objects, different stuff like that. But these guys were trying really hard, and I think some of them were more successful than others. And even among the individual artists, some art was more successful than other examples. But it's really fascinating to me that these artists that we're looking at in this first, from about 1915 to about mid 1930s, these artists are very, very interested in trying to work with geometries and simplified forms to express what they want to express. I just think that's really fascinating. And you can kind of see where they're coming from, different perspectives, being influenced heavily by the cultures that they were in. Well, I hope that helps some of you as you explore this. This module, the Stijl movement. Please go through, watch as many of the videos as you can, and look at those articles. And it would be interesting, just skim those manifestos, both of them, and see what you think. Because I think it's fascinating how similar they are on one hand, but how very different they are on the other. Because they use a lot of the same language, but where Italian futurism is bent on destruction through violence, De Stijl is really focused on building a utopia through doing away with the expectations of tradition. You know, where it deals with spiritualism and our spirituality and the subconscious rather than bullets, which that's a really huge difference and very interesting too. Well, I hope you guys had a good time, and I look forward to seeing y'all next week. Have a wonderful week and weekend, and I'm loving what you're doing with the projects. If there's anything that you have questions about, or I haven't regraded something that you resubmitted, please email me. I get to those. I am checking my email every single day, and some of you have gotten responses to your emails like 1:30 in the morning. What I've noticed is for Canvas, sometimes I will get through all the emails, and then the next day a bunch more will show up that I wasn't even aware of. For whatever reason, it didn't show up in the original feed. So if you're not seeing that I'm getting to you, email me directly on my university email, or you can also go to the syllabus, and I give my cell number there, and you can text me. If you're going to text me, make sure that and when you email me, make sure you tell me your name and which class you're in, so I know who you are. Thank you very much. And as always, remember that when you resubmit, I'll go back and give you more points. And my job is to get you the most points you can possibly get. The more times you resubmit and correct your stuff, the better it is, the better your grade will be. I think the midterms are coming up. We aren't going to have a midterm test per se, but everything that you turn in, I will grade, and then I will post that grade that you've earned on the midterms. All right? Have a good week and weekend, and I look forward to visiting with you all on Tuesday. We'll see you.